The thing about palace work is that no one sees you until they need something stopped. I had been at the secondary palace at Kesaldivar for 7 years when the succession audit began. 7 years of child welfare liaison work in the administrative wing, which meant 7 years of corridor floors and filing terminals and grain paste eaten at a desk, while I read through placement instruments and custody registrations, and the particular category of document that sounded like care, but meant something closer to asset management. The compact sent me there as a bilateral welfare monitor, because the palace had a high volume of minor status children passing through its systems, attendants, residential wards, the offspring of staff who lived on site, and the compact's position was that someone should be watching who those children were and where they went when the court's needs changed. I filed 7 years of it. The secondary palace was unglamorous in the specific way that working buildings are unglamorous when they have been working for a long time without being renovated. The primary residence was 2 moons over, all marble halls and formal delegation wings. This one was administrative, which meant long corridors and equipment bays and archive rooms that smelled of processed air and old calibration fluid. I had a desk in the 3rd floor welfare office, a window that looked out onto a maintenance court, and a filing terminal that I had learned the specific temperament of the way you learn the temperament of any long-term working partner. It ran slow when the palace network was doing system pulls. It dropped its connection in the 4th hour of a long archive read. I compensated. I had learned which hours it ran clean, and I scheduled my larger filings accordingly, and I had long since stopped being frustrated by the ones I could not schedule around. The welfare office was not a prestigious posting. Palace appointments in this corridor system went to compact staff who were being tested for something larger or consoled after something smaller, and child welfare monitoring at a secondary administrative palace was neither. I had a colleague in my first year, a man named Drev Korath, who had been posted there as a holding position, while the compact decided what to do with his reassignment request, and he left at the 18-month mark when the request finally resolved. After that, I was alone in the office, which suited me. I did not require company to work. I required a functional filing terminal and access to the bilateral accord documentation and enough grain paste to last through the long filing sessions. The palace kitchen supplied the grain paste. It was not glamorous grain paste. It was the institutional kind that came in packets from the corridor authority supply run, and everything else I managed. There was a small library of welfare documentation in the office that my predecessor had built, and that I had extended over 7 years until it occupied 2 full shelves and a section of the window ledge. Bilateral accord provisions, compact child welfare protocol specifications, Velsoran secondary house administrative codes, the gap period amendments and their legislative commentary, case law from the Welfare Oversight Committee going back 40 years. I had read all of it. I had indexed the parts I used most often so I could find them without thinking when the need arose. The need arose regularly. Not always urgently, most of it was the quiet, continuous work of keeping records current. But the moment when an instrument was filed incorrectly, and a child's protections quietly narrowed, or when a placement category shifted to accommodate a court's administrative convenience, or when a registration timestamp was wrong in a way that benefited someone other than the child, those moments occurred more often than the palace administration would have liked me to notice. I noticed I filed. I had come to understand something about this work by the time the audit began. Child welfare documentation, done correctly, is a form of architecture. You build it one filing at a time, and none of the filings seem significant in isolation. A registration update here, a placement review there, a corrected status notation. But the structure that accumulates is the thing that holds a child's situation in place when the forces around them shift. Most of the children who moved through the secondary palace never required me to do anything dramatic. I updated their records. I flagged intake irregularities for review. I made sure their documentation said what their situations actually were rather than what the palace administration found convenient. It was slow work, and it was quiet work, and no one thanked me for it because no one noticed it happening until something in the record held firm when they wanted it to yield. The audit began on the first morning of the second season. Velsorin succession audits were formal events. They occurred on a 7-year cycle and involved a review of all residential minor status placements currently registered to the palace system, which meant every child with a welfare record attached to a palace address. The purpose, as stated in the bilateral accord, was to ensure that the palace's residential minor placements remained within the compact's welfare guidelines and that custody instruments were current and validly registered. The practical effect was that every child whose paperwork had drifted, and palace paperwork drifted, the way paperwork always drifted in large institutional systems with too many staff transitions, would require immediate remediation, or the child's placement status would be flagged for a review that none of the palace administrators wanted to explain to the oversight committee. I had spent the month before the audit going through every active minor record in my system and identifying which ones needed work. There were 14 that required corrections before the audit window opened. I corrected them, one by one, checking each correction against the bilateral accord specification to make sure nothing I fixed created a new problem in a different field. The filing terminal slowed twice during the larger corrections, and I waited it out. By the time the audit team arrived, I had 14 clean files, a very tired filing terminal, and a moderate headache from the kind of sustained concentration that 14 corrected welfare placements requires. What I had not corrected, because I had not known about her, was the file for the small girl in the archive. I found her on the second evening of the audit, at the end of a long corridor on the 4th floor of the administrative wing, in the back section of Archive Room 9. She was behind a shelf unit that held decommissioned calibration records, the paper kind, bound in gray covers, the sort that no one looked at because the data had been transferred to the digital archive years ago, and the physical binders existed only because no one had made the decision to dispose of them. And she was sitting with her knees drawn up to her chest and her chin resting on them, watching the corridor beyond the open shelf end with the particular stillness of a small creature that has learned to make itself unnoticeable. The kind of stillness that is not tense, exactly, but settled into itself in a way that suggests it has been practiced. She had ash-silver skin and eyes the color of pale amber, the kind that caught the archive's overhead light and held it for a moment before releasing it. Her hair was white-silver, close to the color of the calibration binders behind her, and it hung loose around her face in a way that suggested it had recently been formally arranged and had not survived the arrangement. She was wearing what had once been a ceremonial robe, the Velsorin sort, layered fabric in pale tones with metallic trim at the hem. But the metallic trim was bent, and one section at the back had come away from the fabric entirely, and the fabric itself was torn along the left shoulder seam in a way that spoke of a quick pull rather than a slow wearing down. She did not move when I saw her. She watched me. I had spent 7 years in this building. I knew which children were resident on which floor, and I knew this child was not in my active records, which meant either she was new, a recent arrival not yet processed into the welfare monitoring system, or her file existed somewhere in the palace system under a registration I had not been given access to, which would be a problem with a specific technical name under the bilateral accord's transparency provision. I crouched down to her eye level. In 7 years I had learned that there were exactly 2 ways to approach an uncertain child, and the wrong one involved standing over them. I said, "Are you hungry?" She considered the question with the gravity of someone who has learned that questions from adults can mean things other than what they say. She looked at my face. She looked at the rest of me. She looked back at my face. She said, "Yes," in a voice that was very small and completely even. I had a ration supplement in my jacket pocket. I carried them out of long habit. Palace administrative wings were not always efficient about meal times, and I had spent enough evenings filing past the point where the kitchen had closed to learn to carry something, and I set it on the floor between us. She watched it. She watched me. Then she picked it up and opened it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before, and she ate it in small, methodical bites, watching the corridor past my shoulder while she chewed. When it was finished, she folded the wrapper precisely and held it. She said, "Thank you." I said, "You are welcome. What is your name?" Her name, she told me, was Sale. She had a second name and a third name, but she offered those two only, and I wrote them in my notebook exactly as she said them, because when someone tells you their name under those circumstances, it is important to write it correctly. I asked her how long she had been in Archive Room 9. She said, "Since the audit people came." That was the second evening of the audit, which meant she had been there since the morning of the first day. Just over 24 hours, in a room with no food dispensers, no sleeping accommodation, nothing that a small girl hiding behind a shelf could reasonably subsist on except what she had brought with her, which, judging from how she had eaten the ration supplement, had not been much, and from the careful way she held herself I suspected had been exhausted some time before I arrived. I said, "All right, I am going to find you something more substantial to eat, and then I am going to go back to my office and find out why your file is not in my system, and then we are going to work out where you should actually be staying. Does that sound acceptable to you?" She looked at me for a long moment with those pale amber eyes. Something in the assessment she was doing had an adult quality that sat unusually on a small face, the look of someone who has had to evaluate a great many situations for safety without the support of anyone older doing it for them. Then she said, "Yes," and she stood up and straightened the torn shoulder of her robe with 2 fingers in a precise automatic gesture, as if she had been straightening it all week. She came with me without any further discussion. She walked beside me down the corridor at the careful, measured pace of someone adjusting their steps to match someone else's, and when I paused at a junction to verify the route, she waited without any sign of impatience, and when I stopped at the supply cabinet at the end of the 3rd floor to get a proper grain paste packet rather than another ration supplement, she waited beside me with her hands at her sides and her expression composed. She walked beside me down the corridor at the careful, measured pace of someone matching their steps to someone else's, and when the corridor turned, she turned with it without requiring guidance. And when I stopped at the supply cabinet at the end of the 3rd floor to get another ration pack, and the good kind of grain paste rather than the corridor authority supply run kind, she waited beside me without fidgeting. Her file in my records did not exist because her file was in the Palace primary system rather than the welfare monitoring system, registered under a Palace household designation that was not automatically visible to the compact liaison database. I found this out at 11 o'clock that evening, working through the Palace's resident minor registry while Sale sat in the chair beside my desk with a vocabulary tablet from the welfare office shelf, and systematically worked through the 2nd level of the compact language module with the focused attention of someone who had been given a task and intended to finish it. Every so often she would write something in the notebook I had given her, a word, a phrase, the grammatical pattern she had identified underneath 3 different examples. The registration was a problem. She was listed in the Palace primary system as a Palace residential ward, a category that in the Velsoran system meant a minor under the court's administrative care. But the custody instrument attached to that designation was dated 8 months ago, filed by a secondary house officer whose name I recognized from 2 previous placement reviews in which I had filed irregularity notices, and the instrument itself was not a valid welfare placement. It was a household transfer document. The distinction mattered because a valid welfare placement gave the child specific protections under the bilateral accord: right of welfare review, right of compact liaison access, right of placement challenge, right of independent welfare assessment on request, and a household transfer document, whatever its convenience to the court's administrative system, gave her approximately none of those things. Someone had filed a household transfer instrument where a welfare placement should have been. I looked at the filing timestamp. I looked at the secondary house officer's name. I pulled the 2 previous irregularity notices I had filed in which that name appeared and read them both, which took 20 minutes, and when I finished, I sat for a while with the palace primary record and my own welfare monitoring database open side by side and thought about the gap between them and what the gap had been designed to accomplish. I looked at Sale in the corner chair. She had finished the 2nd level and moved to the 3rd. She was working through the 3rd level's idiom section with a slight forward tilt of her head that she got when something interested her. I opened a new file. I filed a welfare placement notice under my own compact liaison authority, using the Section 7 bilateral accord provision that allows a field welfare officer to establish an emergency welfare placement record when a minor under a palace designation lacks a valid welfare instrument. The Section 7 provision required attachment of the deficient instrument as evidence of the irregularity, a detailed explanation of the specific ways in which the existing instrument failed to meet the bilateral accord's welfare placement specification, and the complete welfare monitoring record of the filing officer as documentation of established monitoring authority in the relevant system. I attached the household transfer document. I wrote the explanation, which took 40 minutes because I wanted it to be precise. I attached my complete 7-year welfare monitoring record, all 412 actions, with their dates and citations and outcomes. I timestamped the filing at 23:14. I sent a copy to the audit team's incoming queue with a note indicating it was time-sensitive. Then I made a 2nd cup of grain paste and told Sale that the welfare office was available for sleeping if she wanted to stay rather than going back to archive room 9. The corner chair was wide. There was a folded maintenance blanket in the supply closet. She said yes. She stood and took the blanket from where I had placed it on the corner chair arm and folded it again in a different configuration, and settled herself in the chair with a methodical efficiency that suggested she had made do with worse. She was asleep before I finished the grain paste. I worked until the early hours filing what else needed filing. There is always more to file. The audit team's senior officer came to my desk at 9 o'clock the following morning. He was a Velsoran man, older, with the kind of face that has been doing formal assessment work long enough that the assessment is always present in it whether or not he intends it to be, and he had the file I had sent him open on his portable terminal. He said, "The Section 7 notice you filed last night. You are the compact welfare monitoring officer." I said, "Yes, Marin Voss." He said, "The child you identified in this filing, where is she currently?" I said, "In the welfare office. She slept in the corner chair. I have grain paste if you would like some." He looked at me for a moment. It was not a dismissive look. It was the look of a man recalibrating something he had thought he understood. Then he looked at the file on his terminal. He said, "The instrument attached to this filing, the household transfer document, you have written that it is not a valid welfare placement." I said, "It is not. Section 7 of the bilateral accord specifies 8 required elements for a valid welfare placement of a minor in a palace residential designation. The household transfer document meets 3 of them. The 5 it does not meet are listed in the explanation I attached." He said, "I am aware of what Section 7 requires." I said, "Good." He looked at the file for another moment. Then he said, "The audit review process. The child's placement situation will be part of the formal audit record." I said, "Yes. The Section 7 filing is in your incoming queue, which means it is now part of the audit documentation. The bilateral accord's oversight provisions require that irregularities identified during an audit be presented to the High Council's review committee at the audit's close. I expect you are aware of that provision as well. He said, I am. He looked at Sale, who was at the desk beside mine working through the 5th level of the vocabulary module. She had finished the 3rd and 4th in the night and moved on. She did not look up. The audit officer said, she will have access to appropriate residential accommodation during the audit period. I said, through the welfare office. I would prefer she remains under my monitoring authority while the Section 7 review is pending. He said, through the welfare office. He closed his terminal, he left. I gave Sale the rest of my grain paste. She accepted it without comment and went back to the 5th level. The trouble, when it came faster than I had expected. The Queen arrived at the secondary palace on the morning of the 4th day. This was not part of the standard audit protocol. Succession audits proceeded on their own schedule, and the sovereign did not generally attend them. The audit team reported to the High Council, not the Crown, and the separation was intentional. Her arrival suggested that something in the audit record had surfaced and been transmitted to the primary palace quickly enough that she had made the transit in what could only have been the early morning hours, before the corridor shuttle's regular schedule. She came with advisors. 2 members of the High Council traveled with her, which was formal. She came through the administrative wing's secondary entrance rather than the primary entrance with its ceremonial receiving protocol, which was not. I was told to report to the 3rd floor conference room at 10 o'clock. I went. I brought my documentation file and my notebook, and I did not bring grain paste because the occasion did not require grain paste. The Queen was a tall woman with silver-white hair worn in the formal close braid of the ruling house and pale amber eyes of the same quality I had seen in Sale's face 3 nights before. The quality of precise and continuous assessment that does not stop because the object of it has looked back. She was in formal transit attire, not court robes, which would have required the ceremonial time she had clearly not allowed herself, and she was standing at the window that overlooked the maintenance court when I came in. I had seen her once before in 7 years, at a distance, when a formal delegation passed through the secondary palace en route to a primary corridor meeting. She had been at the front of the delegation, and she had not looked at the welfare office window. The 2 council members were seated at the table. The audit team's senior officer was standing to one side of the room. There were 3 palace administrative staff I did not recognize. No one introduced me to any of them. The Queen did not look at me when I came in. She kept looking out the window at the maintenance court, which I thought was perhaps more interesting to her than I was, or perhaps was not about interest at all. She said, without turning, "You are the Compact Welfare Monitoring Officer." I said, "Yes, Marin Voss. Compact Child Welfare Field Liaison, 7 years at the secondary palace." She said, "You filed a Section 7 welfare placement notice for a child registered to a palace household designation." I said, "Yes, because the existing instrument was a household transfer document rather than a valid welfare placement, and the bilateral accord specifies that a minor in a palace residential setting requires a valid welfare placement instrument. The instrument was deficient on 5 of 8 required elements. The irregularity was material." She said, "The child in question is in the palace's care." I said, "Under a household transfer document that does not confer welfare placement status or the protections attached to that status. The Section 7 filing addresses that. When the Bilateral Accords Oversight Committee reviews the filing and the attached evidence, they will determine the appropriate remediation." She said, "The matter will be addressed through the proper court channels. The palace is aware of the irregularity." I said, "With respect, the proper channels for a welfare placement irregularity that surfaces during a succession audit are the channels specified in the bilateral accord, which are the channels I used. The Section 7 filing and the irregularity notice are the correct instruments for this situation. The audit team's receipt of the filing means it is now part of the formal audit documentation. She turned from the window then and looked at me. The assessment in her eyes was not unkind, exactly. It was the kind of precision that does not require malice. That is simply what it is, calibrated and complete. She said, "The compact's welfare monitoring role at the secondary palace has been a courtesy extended by the court. It is not a sovereign instrument." I said, "The bilateral accord is not a courtesy. It is a treaty obligation. My posting here is established under Article 9 of the Accord, which grants the compact field liaison authority in matters of minor welfare within palace-registered residential designations. The Section 7 filing is authorized under that article. The Oversight Committee's review of the filing is required under Article 11. She said nothing for a moment. The two council members at the table did not move. The audit officer did not move. Then she said, in a voice that was entirely even and entirely clear, "Step back. This does not require your involvement." It was not shouted. It was not an order given in anger. It was the voice of a woman who had been making dispositions for a long time and who had learned that the tone of complete certainty is more effective than volume. The disposition was, "You are a minor administrative figure in a borrowed office on the third floor of an administrative building that no one of consequence visits, and what happens with this child is not yours to determine." I was aware of the council members at the table. I was aware of the audit officer standing to the side. I was aware that the Queen's advisors were watching from the doorway, and that whatever happened in this room would be reported, and that the report would be part of how I was understood in this building going forward, which was already not a flattering understanding. I said, "I understand. I will step back." And I did. I took one step backward, which is what she had said, and I stood there. Because stepping back was not the same as withdrawing the Section 7 filing. The filing was already in the audit record. The irregularity notice was attached to it. My 7-year welfare monitoring record was attached to that. All of it was already in the formal documentation that the audit team was required, under Article 11 of the Bilateral Accord, to present to the High Council's Review Committee at the audit's formal close. That requirement was not contingent on my continued involvement or my standing in this room, or what the Queen thought of either. The bilateral accord did not defer to the Queen on the question of what happened during a succession audit. The filing would go before the High Council, whether this conversation ended well or badly for me. I said nothing else. I had said what I needed to say. She looked at me for a moment longer. The assessment in her eyes shifted to something I could not name, and then she looked away from me and back to the room, and spoke to the audit officer about the remaining audit timeline, and I was not spoken to again. When the conversation shifted, and it was clear no one intended to address me further, I left the conference room and walked back down the corridor to the welfare office. Sale was there. She looked up from the vocabulary tablet and looked at my face. She said, "She told you to step back." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you did." I said, "One step, that is what she said." Sale set down the tablet. She said, "She does that with people she does not think matter. She tells them to step back and then she watches to see whether they keep going. If they do, they did not understand the instruction. If they stop, they understood it and they believe it applies to them." I said, "Which is she expecting from me?" Sale considered this. She said, "I do not know. You are not a kind of person she has met very often." I said, "I am going to make grain paste. It is past midday." She said, "Yes." She went back to the vocabulary tablet. The 5th level was finished. She was in the 6th. I made grain paste. We ate it at the desk, side by side, in the quiet of the welfare office with the maintenance court outside the window and the filing terminal doing its midday processing pull. I updated 3 records that had needed attention all week and had been waiting while I dealt with more immediate things. The High Council review was held on the 7th day. It was held in the council chamber at the primary palace, which required a transit of 40 minutes on the corridor shuttle. I traveled alone with my documentation files and a thermos of grain paste because the shuttle did not offer a food service, and I had been on enough long days in transit to learn to carry what I needed. The chamber was a formal space. High ceilings of the pale Velsoran stone, the long curved table at which the council's 17 members sat, the raised display section at the center of the room where the session's documentation appeared on the chamber's shared visual system. There were sections for witnesses, for advisors, for the public record. The audit team's senior officer had been presenting the audit findings for some time before I arrived. He went through the 14 corrected files methodically, then the 3 minor flagged items, then the general status of the palace's minor placement documentation. He had the thorough quality of someone who understood that the High Council's review was a formal obligation and not a ceremony, and he was treating it accordingly. Then he reached the Section 7 filing. He said, "There is one additional item in this audit record that falls outside the standard review categories. It is an emergency welfare placement notice filed under Section 7 of the bilateral accord by the Compact Welfare Monitoring Officer, assigned to the secondary palace, attached to a detailed irregularity notice, identifying a household transfer document as a deficient welfare placement instrument." He opened the documentation on the chamber's shared visual system. What appeared on the display was not only the Section 7 filing. What appeared was the complete welfare monitoring record I had attached to it, all 412 actions, the full 7 years, because Section 7 required demonstration of the filing officer's monitoring history in the relevant system, and I had complied with that requirement completely. It filled the display. It filled it the way 7 years of careful, accurate, continuous work fills a display, completely and in detail, and without the gaps that careless records leave. There were registration updates and placement reviews, and corrected status notations and irregularity flags and welfare reviews and follow-up assessments, and the 14 file corrections from the month before the audit. There were the cross-references to the bilateral accord provisions I had cited in each action, and the timestamps going back to my first week at the secondary palace, when I had been a new posting and less certain of the specific temperament of my filing terminal, and had filed everything twice to be safe. And one could see in the early records the slightly redundant caution of someone learning a system, and in the later records the precision of someone who knew the system well and had calibrated their work to it. 7 years, 412 actions, every one of them correct. The council chamber was quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something unexpected has appeared in them. The senior council officer, a woman, the eldest on the council, with the white braided hair of her full term of office and the formal weight of her position in the deliberate economy of how she sat, was reading the display. Not skimming, reading. Her eyes moved from line to line with the attention of someone who understands what they are looking at and wants to understand it fully before forming a view. She moved from section to section. She went back to an earlier section and read a part of it again. She made notes on the stylus pad in front of her, without looking away from the display. It took some time. No one in the chamber spoke. The Queen was at the table. I was standing in the witness section. She had not looked at me when I came in, and she was not looking at me now. She was looking at the display, or she was watching the senior council officer's face, or she was thinking something that her face did not reflect. The senior officer finished reading. She set down the stylus. She looked up from the display and across the chamber, and her eyes found me standing in the witness section. She said in the carrying voice of formal council address, "Marin Voss, Compact Welfare Field Liaison." I said, "Yes." She said, You have been posted at the secondary palace for 7 years. I said yes. She said, you have filed 412 welfare monitoring actions in that period, 107 placement reviews, 63 irregularity notices, 44 corrected status registrations, 14 pre-audit corrections in the 30 days preceding this review, and one Section 7 emergency welfare placement notice. I said yes, those are correct. She said, no action in this record has been successfully challenged on appeal. I said, no. The only challenge on record was to an irregularity notice filed in year 4. The challenge was withdrawn 11 days after filing. She said, of the 63 irregularity notices you filed, 31 identified instrument deficiencies in time to prevent a placement action that would not have met the bilateral accord's welfare requirements. Of those 31, 7 involved children registered under secondary house designations rather than valid welfare instruments. She was not asking, she had read the record. She was stating what the record said so that the record became formally part of the High Council's session documentation, and not only part of the audit report. I said, those numbers are correct. The chamber was very quiet. The senior officer stood. When a council member stands in formal session, it is a statement of position, a deliberate act, distinct from the ordinary movement of people in a room, carrying the weight of everything the council role represents. When the senior officer stands, it is understood as the council's considered position until someone else stands to oppose it. She stood, and she looked at me across the chamber, and she brought her right hand to her left shoulder in the Velsoran formal salute, the gesture between equals, the one given at treaty signings and formal appointments, and the acknowledgement of acts that the council judged to carry permanent consequence. She said, this council recognizes your service. The council member to her left stood, his hand to his shoulder, then the one on his other side, then the next. Down the length of the curved table, one by one in the chamber's formal quiet, the council members stood, and each of them brought their hand to their shoulder, and the salute moved around the table until it had reached all 17 seats, and none of them looked at the Queen when they did it, and she did not look at them. I stood in the witness section and looked at the senior officer. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that, because triumphant suggests something large and performative, a reversal that is satisfying in the way of things that are satisfying because someone has been wrong and you were right. What I felt was quieter than that and more grounded. The feeling of having done a thing correctly for a long time, and of that correctness being, in this moment, legible to the people in the room who had the formal authority and the institutional knowledge to read it. 7 years of records, 107 placement reviews, a filing terminal that dropped connection in the 4th hour and which I had compensated for. Grain paste eaten at a desk at 11 o'clock while a small girl worked through vocabulary modules in the chair beside me. The Section 7 filing timestamped at 23:14 and sent to the audit team's incoming queue. The filing had held its ground. The record had held its ground. I had not needed to hold either of them personally. That is what a correct record does when it has been built with enough care and enough time. It stands on its own in a room where it is read by people who know what they are reading. I said to the senior officer, "Thank you." She inclined her head, she sat, the other council members sat, the audit continued. The Queen left the chamber before the formal close of the session. I did not watch her go. On the transit back, I drank the grain paste from the thermos and looked out the shuttle window at the corridor moon's flat terrain going past in the late afternoon light. I thought about the filing terminal and whether the connection drop in the 4th hour was beginning to occur more often than it had in previous months, and whether this was a sign that the calibration needed adjustment or simply that I had been tracking it with more attention lately and noticing what had always been there. I could not decide. I made a note to monitor it more carefully for the next 2 weeks before committing to a maintenance request. Sale was in the welfare office when I got back. She had moved through the 6th level and started on the 7th. She looked up when I came in. She said, "How did it go?" I said, "It went correctly. The Section 7 filing is in the formal audit record. The placement irregularity will be reviewed by the Bilateral Oversight Committee. The review process takes 37 days from the audit close date, and the committee's determination in a case with a documented instrument deficiency of this kind, a household transfer document filed in place of a welfare placement, with 5 of 8 required elements missing, is generally the establishment of a valid welfare placement under the full bilateral accord protections. You will have welfare placement status, formal right of review, compact liaison access, and independent assessment rights." She was quiet, looking at the vocabulary module. She said, "And the council?" I said, "They read the record." The senior officer recognized the welfare monitoring service. The council saluted. She said, "All of them?" I said, "All 17. She was quiet for another moment. She said, "And my mother, the Queen?" I said she was present. She left before the session closed. Sale looked down at the tablet for a moment. She said, "She does not like being corrected, most especially in a formal setting." I said, "I expect not, but the bilateral accord doesn't require her to like it." She said, "No." She turned the tablet over in her hands once, a small, thoughtful movement, and set it down on the desk. She said, "She will come back. When the Oversight Committee issues its determination, she will come here." I said, "I expect so." That is between her and the bilateral accord's provisions for family welfare placement. There is a separate process for a natural guardian seeking to establish or restore welfare placement standing, and that process is mine to document accurately and to monitor, but it is hers to initiate. My role does not change. Sale nodded slowly. She said, "You are not angry about today?" I said, "About what specifically?" She said, "She told you to step back, in front of the council members and the audit team, in front of everyone." I said, "She did." She said, "She told you to step back and you did, and now they all saluted you." I said, "I stepped back one step." That was what she said. And the filing was already in the record, and the record was already part of the audit documentation, and neither of those things changed because she told me to step back. They were already in motion. Being angry about the instruction she gave me would not have made the record more accurate than it already was, and it would not have moved the filing any faster through the oversight process. Sale was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think she did not expect you to understand the instruction that way." I said, "Possibly not. I am going to make grain paste. It is well past the meal time, and you have been working through vocabulary modules since this morning without anything substantial." She said, "Yes." She went back to the tablet for a moment, and then she set it down again. She said in a voice that held something quieter than its usual evenness, "Thank you, for the archive room, for the filing." I said, "The filing was the correct instrument for the situation. The Section 7 provision exists precisely for this kind of irregularity." She said, "I know. I mean also the other part. The grain paste and the blanket and the vocabulary tablet and the way you crouched down when you found me behind the shelf." I said, "The chair was wide enough. The blanket was in the supply closet and would not have been used for anything else." She said, "I know that too. I mean the choice you made about how to walk into an archive room at the end of a day when you were tired and you found something unexpected behind a shelf." I understood what she was saying. I said, "That was just what seemed right. It was not anything remarkable." She looked at me for a moment with those pale amber eyes, and the assessment in them was the same quality I had first noticed, the quality that sat unusually on a small face and that I understood now had been there for a long time before I met her. She said, "I know. That is what I mean." I made grain paste. We ate it at the desk. The filing terminal ran slow on its evening pull, and I noted in the maintenance log that the drop was happening earlier than the 4th hour now, which meant the calibration adjustment could probably not wait 2 years, and I would need to submit the request sooner. Outside the window, the maintenance court went dark in sections as the automatic lighting adjusted to the corridor moon's evening rotation, one section at a time, the familiar sequence I had watched for 7 years. I had not been in this building for 7 years because anyone had told me to stay, and I had not stayed because the posting carried prestige or advancement prospects, or the kind of visibility that moves a career forward. I had been here because the work required a sustained presence, and the work required that because children move through large institutional systems in ways that created gaps in the record when no one was watching continuously. The gaps did not announce themselves. They formed quietly, in the space between what a document said and what a document was supposed to say, and you only found them if you read carefully and knew what the correct version looked like well enough to notice when you were looking at something else. Someone had to watch. Someone had to understand the system well enough to see the gaps as they formed rather than after they had already allowed something incorrect to happen to someone small. I had been that someone. I would go on being that someone for as long as the posting required it. When the Oversight Committee issued its determination and the valid welfare placement was established, and Sale's situation was secured under the full protections of the bilateral accord, I would update her file and move to the next record that needed attention. There were always records that needed attention. 412 actions over 7 years, and not one of them had been the last thing necessary. There was always a next filing, a next irregularity flag, a next correction. That was the work. It was not dramatic. It did not require anyone to see it while it was happening. It accumulated the way architecture accumulates, one piece at a time, until the structure was there and held its ground when the forces around it shifted. The council had read the record and recognized what it said. That recognition was now in the High Council's session documentation, which meant it was permanent in the way that correctly filed documentation is permanent, and it would be there whether I was present to claim it or not. The Queen had told me to step back, and I had taken one step, and everything I had built over 7 years had stood exactly where I had left it. Sale finished the grain paste and washed the cups, which she did without being asked, with the methodical economy of someone who had learned that contributing to a space's upkeep was a form of belonging to it. She went back to the vocabulary module, the 7th level, which had compound grammatical structures she was working through with a pencil, and a notebook making diagrams of the logic underneath the sentences. I updated my maintenance log. I looked at the active file list and noted 3 records for the morning. I looked out the window at the maintenance court, dark now in all its sections, and thought about the connection calibration and the timing of the maintenance request. Then I turned off the desk lamp and left the maintenance court light on, because it came through the window at a low angle that was not bright enough to be a disturbance, but was enough to see by if you needed to get up in the night. I had learned that in 7 years. The right kind of light was not always the brightest one. That had always been enough.